I'm Alyssa DeFilippo, Director of Parent Services at Matrix, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today so we can hear about increasing independence while living at home. We're calling it Cultivating Independence. I'd like to introduce our speaker of the day, Michael Pinkerton. He is the Living Skills Director at Integrated Community Services in Marin. He's worked in the field for about 15 years, and he's also an associate marriage and family therapist. Michael is a wealth of information. He's lends support. He really listens to what you have to say. Just from my own personal experience, I've had several chats with him because I live in Marin and ICS services Marin. So he's helped me with direction with my daughter, who's 22 and finishing the transition program and going out into the abyss, as we all now look at it. I see Pam laughing. But the thing about Michael, I think, is that he's a wealth of information. He lends support, he listens well, but he always keeps the young adult and their wishes in the center of the discussion. So I can't think of a more perfect person to discuss increasing independence while living at home than Michael Pinkerton. So Michael, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So just for those of you that don't know anything about Integrated Community Services, Integrated Community Services is an organization in Marin County, and we provide living skills and employment services to individuals with all types of disabilities. So first, I just wanted to go over what the training today will cover. So we'll start off, I'll give a summary of my background, and then I'm going to talk about what, in my experience, is required to build independent living skills while living at home. Then I'm going to talk about some of the problems that I've seen, which make it really difficult to build living skills while at home. I'll go more into depth about 6 particular difficulties that, that I see. And then I'll talk about addressing these areas with some suggestions and fixes. And then I'll work through an example of creating a plan to achieve a certain goal. And then we'll do a Q&A. So about me, I studied psychology at Oberlin College, where I graduated in 1998 with a bachelor's degree. I guess I was sick with chronic fatigue syndrome, and I got help from a chiropractor who practiced homeopathy. And I went to chiropractic school here in California. That's what brought me to California. And I graduated from there in 2005. And I had a part-time chiropractic practice. And I also, at that time, I started working at a Lifehouse. So I started working with people with developmental disabilities at that time in a supported living program. And I was a manager there from 2006 until 2013, and was a part of the senior management team there. I moved on to becoming the ILS coordinator, which is the Independent Living Skills Coordinator at ICS in 2013. And then I became the Living Skills Director when Abby Yim took over as our Executive Director. And that was in 2016. I always had a very strong interest in psychological health, which I would do part-time as a chiropractor, but I realized that it was somewhat out of my scope, and it was sort of my primary interest. So I moved away from chiropractic, and I went to get a Master's of Arts in Marriage and Family Therapy, which I started in 2014, and I finished in 2019. And I'm currently a registered associate marriage and family therapist, supervised by BJ Brown at Seeds of Awareness in Petaluma. So I do both kinds of work. My primary work is as the Living Skills Director at ICS, and then I'm getting hours towards my license as a registered associate marriage and family therapist. So today I'm going to talk about building independent living skills at home. it really does require a multifaceted approach, and it requires really directed intention, and often limited action on the part of the parents. And I think it can often be done more effectively with the help of an outside party, like a therapist, a life coach, an advocate, a regional center ILS provider, or some combination of these. But the presentation today is to help you think through a plan and put together a plan, which, you know, can be done without the help of an outside person. So I think I bring a very holistic type of perspective to this topic as a family therapist and as a director of an ILS program, you know, with a lot of years of experience in the field. I really see building independence as having two sides to it. So the first side is creating a plan to develop certain living skills. And the goal of the plan is to build specific skills that are necessary for increased independence. The value of having a plan is it gets child and parents on the same page. It should set up appropriate incentives if needed. And typically a plan should be time limited. So those are some very important features of any plan to develop independent living skills. Now, there are certain things that I found that tend to get in the way of developing and implementing a plan effectively when someone is living at home. And these include ways of communication in the family, and they can often be positively altered to support the plan. Additionally, there are often interactional processes within the family that can be identified that are demotivating for children and frustrating for parents. And also something else that can be pretty important about keeping a plan going is having reality checking by an outside observer who can give feedback about the process. Now, developing independent living skills is actually, it's very hard. You know, it's very hard for that to happen while a child is living at home. And this goes for any age, you know, from, you know, 15 to 40, really. And some of the problems that I see, and these are sort of the 6 areas that I identify as being most critical in my experience, are many times the individual has no drive or need to actually learn these skills. Often children don't listen or take instruction from their parents very well, so it can be very difficult for parents to teach their children skills. Thirdly, there's something that I call the demotivating skills gap, and I'll explain a little more about that later. So something else that I've noticed is that familial patterns are not typically organized around children developing independence. So just kind of the natural way that's developed for the family to function does not lead towards independence in the children. Also, very rarely do families have the time, knowledge, or experience to build independence. And lastly, high levels of frustration within the family tend to get in the way of developing, you know, this new process of trying to build independence. So just on reason number 1, this lack of necessity. You know, when living with parents, and, you know, often we can find this in ourselves as we got older when we would go home to visit our parents in their homes, like when we're around our parents, often it doesn't feel like it's necessary to really have living skills. And it's a problem in all households, but it's often exacerbated when a child has a disability. And I think something to ask yourself about the living environment at home is, you know, does the environment create any need or impetus for your child to develop living skills truly? Reason number two, that, you want to teach your children, but they just won't listen. Again, it's just extremely difficult to teach your own children. And again, it's not clear necessarily why this is the case, but this is a problem almost universally for parents that I've come across, run into, worked with for myself as a parent. And it's very common in most families. So as I address some of these issues, I'll talk about some recommendations for how to deal with this issue. Now, the third reason is the skills gap. And so I noticed this especially when I was working in supported living homes, where staff were, teaching certain skills and going over them. And a lot of times the participation of the individual in learning the skills would be really low, like they would really seem not interested. And, from looking at these situations and seeing them, and in particular, there was one particular situation where I was able to observe some individuals living in a home together, and I was aware of how they acted when they knew staff was around, and they just, I was just kind of there doing something else, and they sort of weren't realizing, I think, that I was around, and I saw them very independently go through these tasks of preparing breakfast, and it was totally stunned me because I knew I'd worked with them before, and I knew how they interacted when I was there. So that set off some light bulbs for me. And so what this is, the skills gap, is that it's very difficult for a developmentally disabled person to complete tasks when others in the home can complete the same tasks more quickly, more efficiently, more thoroughly, and without help. So this is a problem that is specific to individuals that are slow to learn or have physical or mental difficulties that make task completion slower, or they have difficulties that make task completion not as thorough. And the way that I think about it in terms of putting myself in their shoes is I think about myself like playing tennis, and I love to play tennis, but I won't want to always have to be playing tennis with, Monica Seles, who is going to be much better than me at tennis in every possible way. That's not going to be typically very enjoyable. And also, even having Monica Seles watch me play tennis would not be enjoyable. And I don't know, for those of you who aren't familiar with tennis, Monica Seles was just a former #1 women's tennis player from the maybe early 90s. So a fourth reason is that familial patterns not being organized around promoting independence. So typically, family patterns, they just develop naturally around necessities. So family patterns develop around getting things done, being efficient, making enough money. If there's multiple children in the home, family patterns are just around keeping the peace, helping things go smoothly. Minimizing work. As parents, we have a ton of work to do. And, we have to find ways to minimize the amount of work. And lastly, maintaining safety. So, maintaining safety is a really central role that we have as parents, maintaining safety for our children. And it's, even more developed and stronger if you have a child, with a disability, and in particular with a developmental disability. So building independence can run counter to this strong, desire and pattern to maintain safety. And building independence then can create a lot of anxiety, both in the individual that needs to build independence and in family members. And it can stand in the way of, building any kind of independence. So all of these things tend to create habits that do not leave the space needed for promoting independence. Reason number 5 is just a lack of knowledge and experience in how to build independence. You know, and typically as a parent, you know, if your first child is a big learning experience and you learn a lot, and if you don't have any more children, then your first child's kind of your test case. Now, if you have a second child, you might have learned a lot from the first child, but oftentimes the second child is so different from the first child. And if the second child, you know, has a disability, for example, that they're, you know, very, very different. So it's hard to apply knowledge learned. So, you know, unless you're having multiple children that are very similar, it's just hard to get experience raising children. In addition, raising a child with a disability has its own set of complications. And I think parents, you know, if we look at our child's independence, we use our own experiences of how we built independence to, you know, maybe model some things or have some methods to build independence in our children. But, you know, we have a child with a disability. It's very hard to fathom what independence might look like for your child with a disability. And on a similar note, it's just more daunting and scarier to consider independence when you feel your child is at risk in a variety of ways. Reason number 6 is high levels of frustration in the family. So just, you know, living with others over time can generate a very high level of frustration with their perceived shortcomings, there are things that about them that bother you. But being quick to frustration, it's a very difficult setting for teaching or learning to occur in. And being quick to frustration often leads both parents and children to giving up on, you know, learning new tasks together. It's important to note that these problems are not automatically solved by moving out, you know, by a young person moving out. And the reason why I know this is because really before I started working more intensively, you know, in the program at ICS, where I work with a lot of, you know, helping create goals for parents and their children who are living at home. Before that, I was always working in supported living programs in which I got to, you know, observe people that had recently just moved out, were, you know, in their first years of living on their own. And what I found is that many of these problems, really all of them, can and often do happen in an SLS home or a group home, especially if staff is there all or most of the time. So in terms of dealing with or thinking about this first reason, the lack of necessity, one way to troubleshoot this issue is think of whether it's possible to remove yourself from any task that your child wants to complete, so that for your child to receive the benefit, your child must complete the task on their own. An example of this would be making a favorite food. So if your child has something they really enjoy to eat, instead of cooking it for them, if it's something that they could either participate in or manage to do completely independently, you know, let them know that you want them to continue to have that food, but that they're going to have to learn to have it. I mean, they're going to have to learn to make it for them to have it, and you're not going to be making it, you know, anymore for them. And that will create necessity. And it can be done around, you know, a few different living skills areas. A second area or second thing to do is to require tasks to be completed to get allowance, gifts, or certain privileges. So this can add necessity. And for example, this can especially be the case if you let your child have a privilege that you normally wouldn't allow. So you're, in that case, you're kind of tying a little bit of an increase in making choices with them taking on additional responsibilities. It's can be, a very good way to move forward. And while both of these suggestions, I think they seem, they seem very simple, but they can really be very effective. And they're quite difficult to implement effectively. I've seen a number of situations where a person has like adequate funds from their birthday and they get money and they have those funds to buy things. And so, it's hard to tie like an allowance or a reward because it's still not going to add necessity. The thing that must be seen in these situations is that it's really the adding of something where kind of almost like the only way your child can get this thing is going to be to take on this added responsibility of learning this skill and participating in it. So dealing with reason number 2, that is they won't let you teach them. And here, looking at, is there a way to remove yourself from the room when your child is completing the task? So maybe initially you are involved in helping to teach cooking, but once you feel like, say, that you feel comfortable with them putting in the ingredients and mixing them, for example, to attempt to dismiss yourself while they do that part of the task. Because what I've found, and being a parent has really strengthened this realization in me, but just in watching the workers and of observing families, it's just so tempting to provide constructive criticism while someone is completing a task, while your child is completing a task, just to chime in kind of frequently. And it's a confidence killer, really, and it also can be a motivation killer when that occurs. Also, anxiety for safety reasons can cause a lot of comments. So sometimes there's ways to troubleshoot so that you can feel safe enough that you can, not pay as much attention and kind of partially excuse yourself. And I see this all the time in our workers, just being concerned around safety, which is a positive, but you have to find a way that doesn't become, again, something that erodes the confidence of the person learning the skill. Another thing that I've seen, again, both on the side of SLS workers and, with families, is, if you want things to be cleaned a certain way, cooked a certain way, et cetera, it can be a real compulsion to allow your child to do the work, but then do some work after them. And again, when that happens, it can be a real, motivation killer. They wonder, why am I mopping the floor if you just mop it after me? And I think it's easy to think that it's doable to not, provide a lot of criticism or make comments, or, do the work after your child. And in all of my experience with myself and with workers, it's very, very difficult, in fact. And so, again, my advice is to just show a few times and let them do it with you out of the way as much as possible. And so dealing with reason number 3, which is the skills gap, there's a somewhat of a similar solution that's offered. So again, is it possible, if you're doing the teaching, to remove yourself from the room when your child is completing the tasks and make it clear in some way that you are not available? Often with children, but in particular with individuals with developmental disabilities, I've noted that doing something wrong and the concern about doing something wrong and what might be said by the by the person that's instructing them can really hurt their ability to take initiative to complete the task, almost like they don't want to do the next step because they don't know, if they're going to be told that they're not doing it correctly or not. Even when the corrections are made in the nicest way possible. And so at ICS, we train staff to use what's called most to least prompting methods. And most to least prompting methods are a natural way where when you begin to teach, you're much more present and you're gradually supposed to be pulling back your presence. And I'll provide an example. But so typically, like with cooking, for example, you would start with modeling and demonstrating the task. So that would be like the most kind of highest prompting level. You'd be modeling, they're watching you, maybe participating a little bit. And then you would move into where you're not actually doing the task, but you're prompting them through every step, directly prompting each step that they need to do. And as they get more comfortable and learn, you move into a stage where you are asking questions like, okay, what do we do first? Okay, and is there something else you need to do here? Is there something next? And you ask questions that you want them to be able to solve and answer. And then once they're able to move through the task and, with just this indirect style of prompting, then you can move to maybe where they just, if it's cooking, maybe they just can work off either a recipe in a book, something that's written out more simply maybe, or maybe something that has pictures, but it would provide a visual prompt that they can look at that and get through the task. And at this point, you want to be increasingly removing yourself from the situation and allowing them to work through it as much as possible. And maybe there's some parts of the task, like putting something in the oven, where for safety reasons you do need to be there more. But whatever parts you can kind of excuse yourself for, that's really important to be able to do. And so, for example, with our instructors, eventually many times when they go to people's homes, they may just prompt the beginning of the task, and then the person proceeds to do the cleaning, and the staff person is just there, and they're not actually providing much input or feedback, except at the end, they might note like, wow, you did a really good job, or, oh, why don't you look overall at the floor and see if there's anywhere you missed. So that's a most to least prompting methods. So another thing that when I meet with our instructors individually, I often recommend that they do is, instead of, as the trainer or instructor or parent, we're kind of always almost like in an expert role. And so there are things you can do to purposely slow down, act like you're unsure, or in other ways, just kind of change that dynamic a little bit. So it might be doing things like saying, oh, we got to get started. I can't quite remember. What do we say we're going to do first? Or you do something, if you're showing how to do something and you've already shown it, before, you do it wrong, and see if they catch you, and they notice. And a lot of times, the person you're working with may catch on and realize that's what you're doing. And occasionally they could be bothered, but many times it just makes it a little bit more fun and just changes things up a little bit. So, doing this can definitely help. So, the fourth thing that I mentioned before was changing familial patterns. So now here, a lot of times it requires I'm an outside observer, and this could be like a family therapist, sometimes an ILS provider, or like a life coach, to just spend a little time with your family and to locate and observe any patterns of interaction that interfere with cultivating independence. Um, and you know, it could be a pattern of like the child brings up something they want to do, that's maybe unrealistic, but they're sort of motivated to do. The parent makes a comment about it being unrealistic, and then the child suddenly is very demotivated. Um, and a lot of interactions like this can happen. Um, and many times the parent has very good knowledge about why this particular thing that the child is interested in is not really appropriate or not going to happen. Um, but it's sort of the pattern of interaction that can be really important to address. And they can be identified and pointed out to family members, and alternative patterns can be discussed, where, you know, the issue is addressed differently, um, and then this different way of doing things can be agreed upon. It can really help to deal with some patterns that don't tend to cultivate independence, and some patterns that may be, frustrating for all members of the family. Um, and typically, some follow-up should occur with things like this, because if you do come up with a new way of handling something, it usually requires some encouragement to stick to it, because other issues can come up in the course of this. And patterns do tend to be habitual, and so a lot of effort can be required sometimes just to make a minor change. So dealing with reason number 5, this is a lack of knowledge in what it takes to build independence in the home. So there are certain developmental processes that individuals go through and their period of growth. Two concepts that are mentioned in the psychological literature are individuation and differentiation. And if these concepts are a little bit better understood, some of adolescent behavior and young people behavior, and people with developmental disabilities may exhibit these behaviors at an older age. Some of their behaviors can be seen in light of these concepts and looked at and kind of addressed differently. Just to make a comment about individuation, that's kind of the process through which someone becomes an individual and gets to know themselves and kind of build confidence in themselves. So certain rebellious acts or other acts that are negative and hard to deal with within the family, sometimes when seen in light of these concepts, it can help sometimes foster a solution or just make it a little bit easier to deal with. Dealing with reason number 6, which are high levels of frustration. Well, sometimes frustration is present, but it's not like fully acknowledged kind of in a helpful kind of conversation. And that kind of does not help to improve things sometimes. And often, I've seen this done in a therapy setting most often, but once voiced, sometimes the sources of frustration can be addressed and lessened meaningfully. I think usually it's really important to understand that as a parent, if you're frustrated with your child, that's typically very, very justified. And, if the underlying source of frustration can be dealt with in some way to get some positive movement, that's going to be very beneficial for the family. And similarly, frustration in the child usually is very, very valid as well. If there's a way to meaningfully address it, can really make a big difference for, the family system. Frustration can also sometimes just be a natural byproduct of the living situation, and sometimes this can be altered. Sometimes things like certain routines or location of a bedroom. Sometimes there are things that can be altered or moved that just create less frustration in the family, and they're just very practical things. So sometimes having an outside person, that's aware of the setup in the household, suggestions can be made to change some things up. Well, overall, the biggest key to progress in developing independent living skills is to have a plan and to stick to it. It's creating a plan and a timeline for how your child will learn independent living skills. Then making sure that your child is motivated by something within this plan. Some examples would be, the possibility of driving, or having more money to spend, maybe having more freedom to spend. There's all kinds of different possibilities. All plans should be limited to a single goal area. That just simplifies things a lot and typically allows for progress, and is particularly well suited to people with developmental disabilities. And the plan will function, again, best if time limited, because you have a shorter time horizon makes for an increased likelihood that the plan can be achieved and the goal can be achieved. And I learned this when I came over to ICS, and I got familiar with the structure of job coaching and the employment services that we provide. And in one of those programs, goals are all short term. You have a short amount of time. And what I found was that people learned much more when there was a short time horizon. Because in supported living, plans last a year and someone's going to get that service indefinitely. And that was where I had a lot of experience before I came to ICS. People did not make a lot of gains, I found. Okay, so also plans must be tailored to the ability level of the person. So I'm going to go over an example. And the example I'm using is a combination of individuals that I've worked with over the years with autism, cerebral palsy, and another person with a non-specific intellectual disability. So it's kind of an amalgam of this that I use to create my example. So a plan can be created for nearly any ability level, but plans will differ greatly based upon that level. So for example, just in general, individuals with different ability levels need varying amounts of support. So an individual who will likely need to cook or engage in other activities with support, for the foreseeable future, will require goals that include that support. So that individual's goals may be that they participate in a certain part of the cooking task, as opposed to, cooking the meal, say, fully on their own. So this is the example. And so this is a family. They want their son with a developmental disability generally to become more independent. So they have this general goal. Their son will become more independent. Son is, 23 years old. And one example of this, one thing they feel that he would be capable of doing is to learn to use the bus to go to the local grocery store and purchase some items for the family. So other important things to note. The son is anxious about doing this, doesn't really like going out to places that are crowded, that have people. He prefers to stay home, play video games. So the parents wanting him to do this for the past year or so has not propelled him into taking any kind of action. He loves to eat gluten-free frozen pizza, which is not a family favorite. He enjoys certain snack foods deemed acceptable by parents, but again, no one else in the family really likes those snack foods. The family, there's currently a struggle around video games. The parents don't approve of buying violent type games, which he's interested in, or R-rated type games, and they will not allow them in the house. And kind of emotionally, he's a little bit withdrawn. The dad is frustrated with the what he feels like is this son lack of wanting to develop skills, and the mother is concerned about the son's anxiety and how difficult it is for him to function in the world because of his anxiety level. So to develop this plan, it's important to address those things that I previously discussed. In particular, the necessity to develop these skills, kind of figure out who will teach the skills, and then to make sure there's not demotivation when when the instruction is happening. So to address necessity, and just to say this first, the first thing typically really is being unable to settle on a particular goal and getting caught up in the fact that there's just so many goals and so many things that need to be developed. It's just a lot. People feel like it's so much to bite off, it's just more than you could possibly chew or do. So just narrowing it down to one particular goal is like a really critical first step. So narrowing it down to this grocery shopping, right? So one thing to do as parents, one suggestion would be to refuse to buy frozen pizzas or favorite snack foods, and let him know that he's perfectly welcome. He can have them. He just needs to learn to get these items and go to the store to get them. And then, as parents, you have to not buy them. If that doesn't motivate him immediately, you have to not buy them and wait him out, see if he'll get motivated because he really wants these items. Number two, again, addressing the necessity issue would be to try to find some kind of compromise, to try to find a video game that, maybe is in a gray area. You normally won't let him buy it, but it is the most acceptable to you, and let him earn either money or points to buy to buy it by going to the store. So it's like a token kind of a system. Number two, the fact that he won't be taught by you as a parent. You just can't teach these things. Well, if you can find an older sibling, a schoolmate, kind of a cool relative of some kind, or if you're working with the regional center, an ILS provider, or an advocate that you hire privately to teach the skills. That can be a way to get yourself kind of out of the picture, because, in this case, it's clear, right, that he won't listen to his parents. So it'd be very hard for them to teach him. And often parents, you don't have the time for it either. Okay, so then the skills gap. With learning grocery shopping, the skills gap is not as critical from what I've seen, but what is really important is to take a back seat in some way during the grocery shopping trips, so that, after the person has kind of learned and gotten comfortable with items to buy and some things to look for, that whoever's doing the teaching can't be always looking over their shoulder to do corrections or that. So they have to have a way and a system to be backing off. That's very important. So some of the possible roadblocks to developing and implementing a plan, in terms of feelings, and these are just kind of different objections and different things that people have brought up through the years. So one difficulty I already mentioned is just being unable to settle on a particular goal. Another thing is that, as a parent, you want to have a nice environment for your child, and buying, having the favorite foods around the house is really nice. So not buying them can feel like really punitive or mean. So, if, so in this case, like, as an example, I'm saying that the parents say that they feel this way, right? So that is something that would have to be addressed. Also, say in this case that the parents are saying, nope, we're not willing to compromise on this video game issue. And here it's really the only thing he seems to be motivated strongly by, other than possibly the foods. So again, that could prove to be like a roadblock to getting him motivated. Another thing is sort of kind of being too worried about potential dangers as he becomes more independent. So maybe the idea of grocery shopping is okay, but where that might lead to, or how independent, if he's completely grocery shopping on his own, what could happen then? So worries about potential dangers kind of get in the way of, going with a plan and trying to start up a plan. So another thing that can happen is the child refuses any idea or suggestion, appears to shoot everything down. It's a hard one to overcome and pretty common as well. And when I say child here, I mean child only in the sense of your parents and this is your child, this age anywhere from 16 to 50, really. Another problem can be you can't locate someone to do the teaching. And another problem is that you do, but the helper just ends up enabling, and basically, the person doesn't learn the skills. They just have someone now who, they go with, and that person kind of does the activity. So those are some of the things that might get in the way of developing and then implementing a plan. So typically, if you want to develop a comprehensive plan like this that kind of addresses all these aspects, there's some negotiation that needs to take place. And this can be done as a family without outside help, or again, it can be done with outside help. So, so an important thing to address is this, the idea that it's mean to not have the favorite foods in the house. But really, if you look at it differently, just having to work for something in itself is not mean, and can really help build independence. So in that sense, and kind of in more of a long-term, long view, it's not, mean, even though temporarily it may feel mean or punitive. So the second thing was around the video games, and here, trying to really I think really understanding that this is the big motivator. And there are also developmental reasons sometimes and individuation reasons why a child might go against their parents in certain ways as they're kind of developing a sense of self. But anyway, if there's a way to find a compromise there, this can really, make a big difference. So here, negotiation, and the parents are willing to, they found a video game that's kind of in between, and that he would be excited to play, and the parents feel not great about, but they feel better than some of the worst games. So then the parents find that his sister is coming home from college, and she will help instruct him, and she's willing to do it over her summer break. So that's great. And then, she was provided with some resources for her around most to least prompting, so that she, learned some of these principles about avoiding enabling. So another thing was we limited the plan to learning grocery shopping over a 3-month period. There was no learning to use the bus piece. That would be something that could be done later. So just learning to grocery shop and be independent in the store itself. The worries about the eventuality of him going on his own and what that would mean are just kind of shelved temporarily. We understand that those are there, but just shelf them, because as his competency level changes, maybe, the worry about it will go away, or, maybe it's just important that this next step is taken, and then you kind of can cross that bridge when it comes. When he refused suggestions, and this can be a really difficult one, and just kind of acts like he's not going to participate, if it's possible, as parents, if you're able to not seem invested and just say, okay, but still, we're not going to get those foods for you, just, so we won't be buying them anymore. And then kind of revisit the issue. Sometimes that can be effective. So in this case, I'm suggesting that was effective, and he came around. And it's important in this setting to either as a family to have follow-up meetings, that just the plan is being stuck to, that this is important. And you can have an outside person that helps do this, or you can do this as a family, but just kind of check-ins. How's it going? Is it still going well? So this is kind of the nuts and bolts of the plan. I agreed to learn to grocery shop independently by August 31st, 2020. And the plan would start, say, like on June 1st, when the sister comes home from college. The agreement is that trips will be twice a week. It's very important to spell this out, how often it's going to happen, and have agreement for it. And then what's going to happen on the trip. So during each trip, 2 favorite foods can be picked in addition to purchasing the other items on the list. So the family will provide a list, and then he gets full choice over whatever 2 favorite foods he wants to buy in addition. Parents agree that no other favorite foods will be purchased while the plan is in place. So this is the only way that he's going to get these foods. After each trip, parents will set aside $2 for the video game fund. So maybe, you work this out so that if he does, 90% of the trips, at the end of the time, he'll have the money for the video game. And when the goal is reached, the money can be used for his purchase of Assassin's Creed or Modern Warfare. I don't know. Those are 2 video games I've heard of that are sort of this type. Though the parents can still, let him know they'd rather him get an alternative, non-violent game, but those games are okay. And everyone is in agreement that the older sister will implement the plan when she's home from college, and the older sister agrees to research the most to least prompting model. And I would just add to this that, like, it'd be good to monthly check in on, the plan and how it's going. Or you might want to check in, weekly, with the sister about how it's going, just to see that things are moving along. So in summary, building independent living skills at home, while difficult, is possible, especially if you pick an achievable goal and make sure that everyone involved, really the whole family, is motivated to achieve the goal, that you find incentives if needed, and that the incentives really have to be sure to be a motivator, not something that you kind of think might be a motivator, but something that definitely will be a motivator. Create a simple plan to reach that goal. Deal with any roadblocks, anything that seems to be getting in the way. Stick with the plan until the goal is reached. And if you do, if you do start and want to carry something like this out, if you get help or get stuck, I would just suggest seeking out an ILS provider if your child is with the regional center, a therapist, a life coach, or advocate, or some combination of these that can help through the process. That's the presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this training. Hopefully, Michael has some other ideas up his sleeve, so you'll see him returning with more trainings for us. And yeah, I think that could be it.